All right. So now we come to the final meditation, meditation 6. In this video, I'm going to cover 4 different things. First, we're going to look at the argument in meditation 6 that Descartes gives for the claim that the external world exists. Descartes will finally overcome all of the kind of skeptical doubts and worries that he had raised in meditation 1 here in meditation 6. Second, we're going to, that first argument, that first part is going to be pretty quick. It's pretty straightforward, quick argument. Second, we're going to look at Descartes' quote unquote substance dualism. He never uses that phrase. That's a phrase that people kind of invented after the fact to discuss views like Descartes. We'll discuss what that phrase means, what substance dualism is. We'll discuss the argument that Descartes gives for it. We'll talk about the particular kind of substance dualist that Descartes is. And we will talk about the main problem that people raise for Descartes' argument for substance dualism. So this will take up a good chunk of the video, Descartes' substance dualism. After we finish talking about that, I'm going to talk about the main problem that people raise for Descartes' philosophical project. This is something called the Cartesian Circle. We'll talk about how exactly that works, why exactly it's a problem, after we talk about substance dualism. And then last, I'm going to say some things trying to situate Descartes in terms of the themes of the class. We've been talking about the themes of the class. This is a kind of introduction to philosophy. And so we've been talking about these 3 branches of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. We'll situate Descartes within those 3 branches. What is he primarily interested in? Which of his theories fall under which category, and so on. And we'll also have occasion to compare Descartes to the other philosophers we've covered, Plato and Aristotle. All right, so let's turn to his proof that the external world exists. So you can find this in Meditation 6, page 24. Well, what's at stake here? What's he talking about? The external world exists. What does that mean? What would it mean? Recall where we were in Meditation 1. So Descartes had raised all of these skeptical hypotheses. We might be dreaming. And so who knows whether or not you actually have a hand right there. Even more pressing, there might be a deceiving God. And so who knows, you have a hand right there. Descartes had been operating under this assumption of skeptical doubt. And so all of the things kind of outside of us, your hand right there, outside your mind, right? That's what you are, according to Descartes, is your mind. So all the things outside your mind, such as your hand or the computer or the trees outside or whatever, we don't know whether those things exist. There might be a deceiving God, right, who makes you think those things are out there, but they're not. Or you might be dreaming. And so all of these things are just being made up by your mind. You might not even have a body. Maybe your mind is just dreaming that you have a body. Yeah, something like that. Descartes would take all of these kinds of things that I've been referring to, your hand, the tree outside, your computer. We could call all of those things the external world, right? It's the world external to your mind. When Descartes talks about this on page 24 of Meditation 6, he refers to body. And what he means by body in this context is not your hand and arms and legs and not your physical body. By body, he means anything that is physical and extended, that takes up space. And so in Descartes' sense, the tree outside would be a body. Your computer would be a body. These are material things that take up space. In Meditation 6, page 24, what he does is he argues that bodies exist out there, that they are not just ideas in my mind, but they're out there. The tree is actually there. Your hand is actually there. You might recall that, well, I thought he did this already. He proved a non-deceiving God exists. Well, yes, he does, and this idea is going to come up in this argument. But he hasn't explicitly shown that we can trust our senses yet. That's what he's going to do in this argument for the claim that the external world exists. We can trust our senses. Our senses tell us there's a tree. You can believe that there's a tree. Descartes is going to draw out these implications. All right, so how exactly does it work? The way Descartes puts it, as I was describing, is in terms of bodies, right? And so what I have here is corporeal things that are corporeal, that are made of matter, that take up space. What Descartes says is that if my ideas of those things, of corporeal things, do not come from corporeal things, well, then God is deceiving me. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. According to Descartes, when you look at your hand right now, you have an idea of your hand as you're looking at it, right? If that idea of your hand does not come from an actually existing hand right there, then God is a deceiver. That's what Descartes is saying, right? You have an idea of your hand. You can be sure that you have this idea. Can you be sure that there's actually a hand right there? Descartes is saying, yes, now we can be. Essentially is what he's arguing here in this argument, right? Because if there's not actually a hand right there, well, then God is deceiving me. Why would God be deceiving you if there's not actually a hand right there? His idea is something like this. God has implanted in us, we see it in our very nature, right? We have this very strong natural propensity to think that there's a hand right there. When you're looking at that thing, you have a very strong natural propensity, natural inclination to think there's a hand right there. It's not just my idea of no, there's an actually existing hand right there. My idea of the hand is coming from an actually existing hand. God put that natural propensity in me. It's part of my nature. I didn't learn it anyhow. I just have this natural, very strong propensity to think that when I see a computer in front of me right now, there's a computer right there. That's why it's appearing to me that there's a computer right there. And when I see a hand, why is it appearing to me that there's a hand right there? Because there's a hand right there. Right? Now, God put that propensity in me, that natural inclination to think that those things are there. And so if those things aren't actually there, God would be deceiving me by giving me that propensity, by giving me a propensity to think that there's actually a hand there when I have the idea of a hand, right? If that was false, if there weren't actually a hand there, God would be a deceiver, right? You'd be deceiving me by giving me that propensity. But we know from the third meditation, God is not a deceiver. And so if God has given me a natural propensity to think that there's a hand right there when I'm looking at my hand, well, then there's a hand right there, because God wouldn't deceive me. And so Descartes concludes, my ideas of corporeal things, your idea of your hand, your idea of the tree outside, your idea of your computer when you're looking at your computer, my ideas of corporeal things issue from corporeal things. That is to say, when you're looking at your hand, your idea of your hand comes from an actually existing hand right there, right? That's what Descartes is concluding. And well, if that's true, well, the external world exists. That's just another way of saying the external world exists. And so because we have this divine guarantee, because God's not a deceiver, and God gave us this natural propensity to think that our ideas of corporeal things come from corporeal things, we can rest assured that the external world exists and that our perceptions kind of map onto it. I see my hand there. I see that it has 5 fingers, and so, right? That's what it's actually like. Because I have a very strong propensity to believe that my ideas come from these things. That natural propensity, since it's part of my nature, came from God. God would be a deceiver if that natural propensity led me astray. God's not a deceiver. And so I know that my hand is right there, and that it is how it looks, right? I'm not dreaming. There's not any great deception or anything like that. Yeah, I can trust my natural propensities. And so we finally got now to the point where we can start throwing perception back onto this edifice of knowledge that we're building. We can start trusting our perceptions now. And the reason we can is because we have this kind of divine guarantee, because we've proved God exists and we've proved that God is not a deceiver. That's what's going to validate then our perceptive faculties, our perceptions. We can trust our perceptions. We don't need to have these skeptical worries any longer, because we have this divine guarantee. And so it's not until we get to the sixth meditation that we really finally overcome those stages of doubt, those skeptical hypotheses. Now, to be clear, Descartes himself is not a skeptic. A skeptic is someone who thinks we can't have knowledge of things. We need to be skeptical about everything. Descartes thinks we can have knowledge of all kinds of things. And in fact, we can know that you have a hand when you look at it, right? He's most famous perhaps for his skeptical hypotheses, but he doesn't actually believe those hypotheses. He doesn't actually think that we can't know anything. And we see that very clearly here in the sixth meditation, right? Descartes has finally overcome this skepticism, given a sure foundation for our perceptive faculties, right? That's the idea. All right, moving on to substance dualism. Now, as I'd mentioned at the beginning of the video, Descartes doesn't use this phrase. You won't find this phrase in the meditations. And so before we see what exactly it maps onto in meditation 6, a quick word about what it means. So there are two words that make up that phrase, substance and dualism. You can kind of read the meaning off of, so substance dualism is a theory. You can figure out what the theory means just by reading those words. Substance is just like a thing, like an independently existing thing. So the lamp is a substance, I'm a substance, the computer is a substance, just like a thing that exists. Dualism, well, that just means two. And so substance dualism is, first pass at it, it's going to be a theory according to which there are two kinds of things. There are two basic metaphysical kinds. The world, everything in it, ultimately comes down to two different kinds of things. Two different kinds of things make everything up. Yeah. A monist, a substance monist, would be someone who thinks there's only one kind of thing. Descartes is a substance dualist. He thinks there are two kinds of things. Substance dualism means, so it doesn't just mean that there are two kinds of things. It also includes with it a particular account of what those two kinds of things are. There are minds and there are bodies. Descartes is a substance dualist in this sense. He thinks there are ultimately two basic kinds of things that exist. There are bodies on the one hand, and there are minds on the other hand. Minds are not bodies. Bodies are not minds. By bodies in this context, when Descartes is talking about these issues, when he's talking about substance dualism or issues related to substance dualism, as I was just saying previously, when he uses the word body, he's referring not to, organic body that makes you up, although that would be included under the heading of body. Rather, Descartes, when he uses the word body here, is referring to something much more general, what we might call matter. Extended things, right? Bodies are material things that are located in space. That is to say, they take up space. That's what it means to be extended. Descartes will use that word too, extended, right? Bodies are extended. They take up space. They're material. They're made out of stuff, right, that take up space. That's one kind of thing, right? And you see those all around us. We just showed that those actually exist out there. That's what his argument for the existence of the external world was. That's one kind of thing. There are also minds, however, which are a different kind of thing and are not reducible to bodies. Minds are not made out of matter. They are immaterial. And they're not located in space. They are unextended. They don't take up space. In order to take up space, you have to have extension. You have to be material. Minds are not like that. That's the basic idea. And we've seen the seeds of this idea in the second meditation when we were talking, when Descartes talked about, well, what am I? And he argued, I'm a thinking thing. I might not be my body. My body might not exist. What was kind of the seeds of that were planted there was this idea of substance dualism, that there are two kinds of things, minds on the one hand and bodies on the other, right? And so in many ways, I think substance dualism is a kind of, a lot of people find it intuitive. They find it to be commonsensical. Well, of course, isn't that just the way it is? I mean, some people don't, and it's not that everybody does or anything like that. But the idea that there's, your body on the one hand, and then your mind on the other hand, and that there are different kinds of things, and that your mind is it's not really your body, even if it's kind of hooked up to it in a certain way. Your mind can't be cut in half or whatever, whereas your body unfortunately could be. That's substance dualism. This idea that your mind might be some sort of immaterial thing, and maybe it's like who you really are, right? This immaterial thing is kind of hooked up to your body and controls it and is in charge of it, right? Tells it what to do. But they're two radically different kinds of things. That's substance dualism. And so you may have heard this phrase even sometimes in psychology classes when you kind of do a history of psychology or whatever, in a textbook or something like that, or perhaps in a lecture. You'll see Descartes mentioned in this regard, right, as a substance dualist. And Descartes really is kind of the arch substance dualist. Now, what we're going to do is look at the argument that he gives for this, right? Because this is a pretty strong claim. Descartes, the main opposition to this claim would be something like, some people call it, you could call it different things. You call it physicalism. The only things that exist are physical things, and everything else is reducible to physical things. And so, yeah, sure, fine, people have minds, but minds are nothing more than brains, or are simply certain arrangements of brain states or something like that. Really, all there is are physical things, right? Descartes is denying that. That would be a contrary to position to what Descartes is arguing. Or it's sometimes also called, as we saw on the exam, on the Aristotle exam, materialism, philosophical materialism, right? Materialism would be a kind of substance monism. It would say that the only thing that exists are material things, things that are extended and can take up space. What does that mean? You don't have a mind? Would a materialist have to say, no, not quite? They would try to reduce the mind to material things, like we were just talking about with physicalism. Physicalism, materialism, those are two names for, more for our purposes, for the same philosophical theory. And so Descartes is disagreeing with people like that, and people like that, these physicalists and materialists, would disagree with Descartes' substance dualism, right? Okay, so what is the argument then that Descartes gives for substance dualism? It's somewhat complicated, and it's found on page 23. So we're going to spend some time trying to figure it out. It's kind of a mouthful. So what we're going to do, we're going to lay it out in a little bit, I think, a little bit clearer of a way than Descartes himself lays it out. And then I'm going to try to simplify it to the degree possible by showing you the logical form of the argument. Okay, so here it is. The first premise, it's a mouthful. This is the longest one. He says something like this. If I can vividly and clearly understand, right? So there's that phrase again, vivid and clear perception, as we talked about previously. Intuition, knowing by the light of nature, all the same thing for Descartes, right? So now he's talking about vividly and clearly understanding something. Okay, same thing, right? So if I can vividly and clearly understand one thing without understanding it to be some other thing, and if I can vividly and clearly understand that other thing without understanding it to be the one thing, those two things are distinct. They are not identical. They are different things. That's what this first premise claims. And so I use X and Y, right? If you can vividly and clearly understand X without understanding it to be Y, and then vice versa, understand Y without understanding it to be X, those are not the same things. They are not identical. They are distinct. And he goes on to claim God, if God wanted to, could separate those things. Maybe they come together in a certain way or whatever, but God could separate them. If you can vividly and clearly understand them without understanding each other, right? Understand the one without understanding the other, understand the other without understanding the one, they could be broken apart. They're distinct, not identical kinds of things. Okay, that's a general principle. Now, Descartes is going to apply this general principle to the mind and the body. So he's going to say, I can vividly and clearly understand my mind to be a thinking thing, which we, right? Go look at meditation 2, he would say. You can vividly and clearly understand your mind to be a thinking thing without understanding it to be extended, right? I can understand the nature of the mind. I can conceive of it. Okay, I'm thinking about the mind. And when I do that, body extension, taking up space, doesn't enter into it at all. When I think about the mind, what is it? What does it do? It thinks. It's a thinking thing. It has nothing to do with taking up space or being extended, right? And the operations that it does, it goes through things. It puts together shapes and colors, right? You can think of a golden mountain, right? You take the color gold and mountain, there's no extension to that. The mind doesn't need to be extended, right? It just performs these kinds of operations, right? So I can vividly and clearly understand my mind to be a thinking thing without understanding it to be a body, without understanding it to be extended or taking up space. And on the other hand, or looking now at body, I can vividly and clearly understand any body, including this one, right? The one that I control, right? But also any other body, the wall, the computer in front of me. I can understand it to be extended without understanding it to be a thinking thing, right? What is the essence or nature of extension of body? Let me put it in terms of body. What's the nature or essence of body? Well, it's just to like take up space. That's it. That's what it does. It doesn't think. When I think about body, when I try to understand what body is, thinking doesn't come into it at all, right? That's not essential to body or to matter. Look, even if you think some bodies think, some material things think, as the philosophical materialists might, yeah. Well, surely they'd have to say that there are some material things out there that don't think. For example, the paint on the wall, right? That's a material thing. It takes up space and, you know, a very thin space, whatever, but takes up space. It doesn't think, right? More generally, what Descartes would say, when you just think about body, right, and body in general, it's just what takes up space. That's it, right? I can understand it to be extended without understanding it to be a thinking thing. Well, if that's the case, Descartes argues, right? In light of that first principle, we can conclude that the mind and the body are distinct, that they are not identical, that they are two different kinds of things, right? The mind is not a body. Mind is not extended. Another way of putting the point, mind and body are separable. Be careful. Don't say mind and body are separate. That's not what Descartes would want to say. That's how Descartes conceives of death. It's your mind and your body separating from each other. So to say that someone's mind and body are separate, according to Descartes, would be to say that they are dead. So don't say that they're separate. Descartes would say, my mind and my body are separable. They could be separated. They will be when I die, right? Something like that is his idea. Okay. So the conclusion, my mind is not a body. Mind and body are separable. That's just another way of stating, more or less, substance dualism. So substance dualism, this philosophical thesis or theory, is the conclusion of this somewhat complicated argument. To understand a little bit more clearly how the logic of this argument is working, and so hopefully to help us understand the argument, I'm going to substitute out these claims. That's a lot of words up there on the screen right now, especially that first premise. If I can, blah, 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 and if I can, blah, 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 well then, right? It's hard to keep all that stuff in mind and see how exactly the argument is working. Now, to be clear, this is a logically valid argument. The logic of this argument works. Whether it's a good argument or not, that's something we'll come to later, or we'll start seeing what people have said on that front. How exactly does the logic of this argument work? Focus on the second claim. I can vividly and clearly understand my mind to be a thinking thing without understanding it to be extended. What I'm going to do, starting with this second claim, is just substitute all these words you see. I can vividly and clearly understand my mind to be a blah, 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 all the way down. Just put a single letter in there to kind of take its place, right? P. This is, for some reason, philosophers, when they substitute out claims, they start with P. So whatever, I guess. I'm a lemming, so I'm doing the same thing. So P simply stands for that claim that we had just seen, right? And so the second premise just states P. P is true. I can vividly and clearly understand my mind to be a thinking thing without understanding it to be extended, right? So instead of having all those words in there, we'll just put P. Now, what we're going to do is proceed in a like manner through 3 and then 4, and then at the very end, we'll come back to 1. Because one of the things that you might have picked up on already, maybe not, but you will once I point it out, is that 1 is simply composed of other claims from the argument. 1 is just a certain arrangement of 2, 3, and 4. All of the claims that you find in 2, 3, and 4 show up somewhere in 1 in some form or another. And so we're going to come back to 1 at the very end. All right, so 2. I can vividly and clearly understand my mind to be a thinking thing without understanding it to be extended. All right, we'll call that P. And then we'll substitute in another variable for 3. Call that one Q. Right? So Q stands for I can vividly and clearly understand a body to be extended without understanding it to be a thinking thing. Same thing for 4, right? Substitute it out for yet another variable. It says something different. It says the mind is not identical to the body. Okay, call that R. So we have these 2 claims above the line, P and Q, conjoined with 1 is supposed to yield the conclusion R. So 1 has to bring all those variables together, and that's exactly what it does. If I can vividly and clearly understand X without understanding it to be Y, if I can vividly and clearly understand my mind to be a thinking thing without understanding it to be a body, right? That first part, right, is just P. If P, yeah, and if I can vividly and clearly understand any body without understanding it to be a mind, right? Because body stands for Y, mind stands for X. And so that second claim is just Q. If P and Q, well then X and Y are not identical, then the body and mind are distinct. The body and mind are not identical. Well, that's just R. And so 1 is really just the claim, if P and Q, then R. If I can understand my mind to be without understanding to be a body, and if I can understand my body without understanding to be a mind, well, then the mind and the body are not identical. That's how the argument is working, right? So it looks really complicated when it has all those words thrown in there, right? When you spell everything out. But when you make these substitutions, it makes the logic of the argument a little bit, I hope, a little bit easier to follow, right? If P and Q, well, then R, well, P and Q, therefore R, right? You can think of it like this. How is the logic of that argument working? I don't know, something like this. If I have my jacket on and I have on my shoes, well, then I'm ready to go on a walk. I have my jacket on. I have my shoes on. Therefore, I'm ready to go on a walk. Yeah, that's the basic idea. The logic is no more complicated than that. That's an easy enough argument to follow. Yeah. That's all, that's the logic behind Descartes' argument. And what makes it difficult is all these words in there, right? And so making these kinds of substitutions, you might find helpful for trying to understand how the argument is working. So now, when you have an argument that is logically valid in the way that this one is, the logic of this argument is airtight. If those premises are true, well, then that conclusion follows. When you have an argument that is logically valid in this way, that doesn't mean it's a good, compelling argument yet. It might still be a bad argument. What you then need to look at is whether or not the premises are true. That's where we're going to go in just a second. People have argued that these premises are not true. And in particular, they have argued that that first premise, that kind of general premise, which I have now right there. People have argued that that's false, and they've used counterexamples to argue that it's false. We're going to look at one of the most famous counterexample that people have used in just a second. Before we get there, however, I want to consider one kind of further characteristic of Descartes' substance dualism. There are varieties of substance dualism. Substance dualists, all these different varieties of substance dualism, are going to agree on substance dualism. They're going to agree that there are two different kinds of substances, minds and bodies. But they're going to disagree on what exactly a person is. Now, Descartes is a, as you might imagine, Cartesian dualist. It's named after the guy, right? What does that mean? It means that he's a substance dualist and that he thinks that you are simply your mind, that persons are simply minds. And so the body, your body, that is not you, strictly speaking, right? So just using that, I think I'm 6'2". I don't know. I haven't, I don't know. Let's just go with that. I am strictly speaking, I am not actually 6'2", because I am not my body. I am simply my mind. That body is not Descartes. The immaterial mind that is hooked up to that body, that controls that body, that interacts with that body, that's Descartes. Same with me. I am not my body. The body is not me. Rather, the immaterial mind, or as Descartes will also put it, the soul, right? And maybe you find that a bit more intuitive, I don't know, or more of an idea that you've heard. The immaterial soul or mind, that is me. Descartes thinks of the body as a kind of machine. It's back in the first video, I talked about the various writings of Descartes. And I said something about this treatise of man that he wrote. And I said it's not an ethical treatise. Rather, it's his account of how the human body works. It's more like physiology or anatomy or something like that. Well, in that book, he makes it clear the body is simply like pulleys and levers. It's like a machine. That's all it is. It's just a particular kind of machine. You know, lots of machines are made out of metal and wood and rope or whatever, right? That's one kind of machine. And well, this thing that you see, my body, it's also a machine. It's just made out of different stuff. It's made out of, you know, tendons and so on, and bones and whatever. Everything else is exactly the same. It's just it's a meat machine. It's not a metal machine. It's a meat machine, right? Something like that. That's Descartes' view. And so you are not your body. Your body is simply a machine that your mind controls. That's Descartes' view. That's Cartesian dualism. You are the immaterial mind, right? So when you conjoin these two ideas, substance dualism on the one hand, there are two kinds of things, minds and bodies. You can join that idea with the idea that, and you are simply your mind. That is Cartesian dualism. Descartes thought that was true. That's very clear from the sixth meditation. There's another kind of substance dualism, however, that takes a different view of what a person is. People have called it union dualism. So union dualists would agree with substance dualism, right? That there are two kinds of substances, minds and bodies, but they would disagree with that second claim of Cartesian dualism. They do not think, a union dualist does not think that you are simply your mind. Rather, a union dualist would say, you are a union of your mind and body, right? And so the body plus the mind equals you, or in this case, right, Descartes, right? Using Descartes as my example. Descartes is not simply the mind. Descartes is the body plus the mind. It's those things together, that's what you are. That's what the person is, right? And so this is a different kind of dualism. Some people find union dualism to be the more attractive or plausible kind of substance dualism. You might think that the body is more important to personal identity than Descartes, than Cartesian dualism would allow for. Descartes, you might think, kind of instrumentalizes the body to far too great an extent, right? The body's not merely a machine. It's kind of bound up with who you are. Arguably, union dualism helps account for that. Right? Because the body is included in who you are. Descartes doesn't want to say that. He actually, what's the word I'm looking for? He abandons, argues against that way of thinking about about the person way back in meditation too. That can't be true. Well, because why not? Because I might not have a body. My body and my mind have two different properties. My body might not exist, but I can be definitely sure my mind exists. Yeah, that was the kind of consideration he raised back in meditation too. And then the argument we were just looking at for substance dualism could also be relevant here. Yeah. All right, so these two varieties of dualism, Descartes being obviously a Cartesian dualist, yeah? Okay. What I want to do now is look at the main problem that people have raised for Descartes' argument. That argument we were just looking at, yeah? And the way I'm going to present it is by means of a counterexample. So as I had indicated earlier, most critics of Descartes' argument took issue with that general principle, that first premise. And the way they show what's wrong with that premise is by giving a counterexample. By using that premise on a different example than Descartes uses, and showing that that premise leads to absurdity, to a false claim, an obviously false claim, right? That premise, since it leads to something that's obviously false, has to be false as well. That's the idea. And the most common counterexample that people give involves Superman. And so I'm going to follow suit. That's going to be the example we use. And I assume everybody is familiar with the very basics of Superman. I've never read a Superman comic, and I am familiar with the basics. The basic idea is that Superman has an alter ego, Clark Kent, but it's secret. Nobody knows that Clark Kent and Superman are the same person, even people who know them well. So Lois Lane knows Superman, knows Clark Kent, doesn't know that they're the same person. Okay. So here's that first claim again. This is going to be the claim that this counterexample tries to show is false. But if you can vividly and clearly understand one thing without understanding it to be the other thing, and if you can clearly and vividly understand the other thing without understanding it to be the one thing, they're not the same. They are not identical. And we're just now going to apply this to Superman and Clark Kent. Right, and we'll use Lois Lane as our kind of stand, and this is whatever, this is how the example goes. So Lois Lane vividly and clearly understands Clark Kent not to be Superman. Clark Kent is the guy who works with her at the wherever they work. I don't know where they work. And Superman's the guy who flies through the air or whatever and just shoots lasers out of his eyes and whatever else he does. She understands Superman, right? Okay, yeah, he's the guy with the lasers coming out of his eyes. And that's not Clark, right? Clark, whatever, he's got glasses and he shatters his glasses all the time because he's always shooting lasers out of them. Right? Two, right? I understand the one to not be the other. I understand the other not to be the one. Yeah? Well, by that first principle then, that what's labeled number one up there, it follows Superman is not Clark Kent. But as I right, that is false. They of course are the same person. That's the whole thing, right? They're the same person. And so what this example shows, arguably, is that that first premise is false. Because, yeah, no, Lois Lane understands Clark Kent not to be Superman, and she understands Superman not to be Clark Kent. Yeah. Well, by that first premise, it would then follow that Clark Kent and Superman are not the same person, are not identical, but they are. They are the same person. They are not distinct. And so that first premise has to be false. Another way of running this same example, or this same idea, the same kind of argument, uses a different example. Instead of Clark Kent and Superman, you could think of it in terms of H2O and water, right? I can understand H2O, right? I read some books or whatever, and say in these books, they never say that H2O is water or something like that, right? But just hydrogen and hydrogen bonds in this way with the oxygens, and you have the electrons, and they do whatever they do, and they, okay, you get these molecules. Okay, fine, I understand all that, right? The hydrogens and the two hydrogens and the oxygen, and they come together. Okay, fine. Got that understanding. I can also understand water. You know, it quenches thirst. It's fun to whatever, you know, I don't know, swim in. You clean stuff with it and so on, right? And okay, that's water. I can understand the H2O without understanding it to be water. I can understand the water without understanding it to be H2O. Does it follow that water is not? No, it doesn't follow. Water is H2O. Those things are identical, right? And so the problem here has to be with that first premise. That's the way these counter arguments go to Descartes' substance dualism. Now, that's not the end of the argument. Some people would, there are ways that Descartes could reply. The most obvious kind of line of replies and be, well, no, I mean something very specific by vivid and clear perception, right? And it's the kind of thing that you don't have of a person, maybe, right? And so, no, I would deny that Lois Lane vividly and clearly perceives Clark Kent or something like that. There's no essence to Clark Kent, and that's what vivid and clear perception is picking up on, or something like that. We're not going to look at exactly how that would be spelled out, but that would be one avenue of reply for someone like Descartes to try to rest this argument and the kind of defense of it on this notion of vivid and clear perception, right? That's really doing a lot of work here, work that these counter examples don't pay attention to. And so when we get to these second and third claims, right, Lois Lane vividly and clearly understands Clark Kent not to be Superman, maybe Descartes would deny that. He would deny 2, he would deny 3. She's not actually vividly and clearly understanding these two things. Maybe she understands, but not in this vivid and clear way. And so a lot hinges on vivid and clear perception. All right, so that might be one way that Descartes could reply. All right. Now we're going to turn our attention to the most famous and arguably most devastating problem for Descartes' philosophical project. Not just a problem for this or that argument, although we've seen those. Yeah, we saw problems. We were just looking at problems for his substance dualism, his argument for substance dualism. And in a previous video, we looked at problems for his argument for the existence of God. Okay. The Cartesian Circle is a problem for the kind of entire project that he is embarked upon in the meditations. And so here's how it goes. So there are kind of 3 nodes to this circle. That's Descartes in the middle there, if you can't, if you didn't know. And what we're going to see that Descartes arguably argues in a circle, and it's bad. He assumes what he's trying to prove. That's, in very general terms, the problem that the Cartesian circle raises. Descartes argues in a circle. He's assuming what he's trying to prove. That's bad. That's a bad argument. All right. So how exactly does it work? We enter the circle, or we're going to begin our journey around the circle, up there at the top with the truth rule. Yeah? So we're starting at that node, up above Descartes' head there. Go back to the beginning of the third meditation. There, Descartes raised the truth rule. Right? So Descartes was reflecting upon what he had done in the prior meditation, in meditation 2. And the main result of the second meditation was the cogito, right? I can be certain that I think that I exist. That's great. At the beginning of the third meditation, he's reflecting upon the cogito, and he says, well, you know what made the cogito so great was that I vividly and clearly perceived it. Well, hey, doesn't that tell me what I need in order to be certain of anything? If I vividly and clearly perceive it, it's true. That's the truth rule. Descartes extracts it from the cogito at the beginning of the third meditation, right? Truth rule. Whatever I vividly and clearly perceive is true. Now, Descartes says it'd be great if I could just help myself to that, but I can't. I need to validate the truth rule. I don't know if the truth rule is true, right? I need to validate it before I can kind of use it. The project of the third meditation is to validate the truth rule. We're going to try to establish and validate the truth rule. And if we can do that, well, then we're off to the races. Then we can get all kinds of, we can start building back all kinds of things and put it into our edifice of knowledge, right? As I'd mentioned in the video on the third meditation. With the truth rule would bring with it all of mathematics. It'd bring with it some very basic principles of physics and so on, right? And so that would give Descartes a lot of knowledge, right? You'd be able to found a lot of knowledge on the truth rule. All right, but we got to validate it. And as we saw, as Descartes said at the beginning of the third meditation, the truth rule might not be true because there might be a deceiving God. That's his one reason for doubting the truth rule, right? It might be the case that when I vividly and clearly perceive something, it's not actually true. I feel that it's true. I have this feeling of certainty about it. 2 + 2 = 4. That's got to be true. But maybe that's just this deceiving God deceiving me, right? I imagine that there's this all-powerful deceiving being who's trying to deceive me at every turn. Maybe he's just deceiving me about 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, well, to get rid of this worry that I have about the truth rule, Descartes says, I'm going to prove that a non-deceiving God exists. To validate the truth rule, we're going to prove that God exists, but that God's not a deceiver. God couldn't possibly be a deceiver. Yeah. And that's what he does in the third meditation. And we looked at those arguments. That's the causal argument for the existence of God, right? I got this idea with infinite representative reality. The cause of an idea must have at least as much intrinsic reality as the idea has representative reality. Therefore, the cause of my idea of God has to have infinite intrinsic reality. That is to say, God exists out there, whatever, right? Prove that God exists, and then also prove that God's not a deceiver. And if we do that, that's going to eliminate the one reason we have for doubting the truth rule, according to Descartes. But as I was just indicating, as I was just kind of saying, right, the proof for a non-deceiving God rests upon certain premises, like the causal principle of ideas. Right? So to prove that a non-deceiving God exists, we need to have certain premises to use. We need to be able to make use of certain premises, such as the causal principle of ideas, or the other key premise in his argument, in the argument for the existence of God. I have an idea with infinite intrinsic reality. Where does that come from? I don't know. This kind of introspection, something like that is the idea. So we're trying to validate the truth rule. And the reason the arrow goes from the truth rule to the non-deceiving God is, well, our validation of the truth rule rests upon there being a non-deceiving God. Yeah, rests upon our proof of a non-deceiving God. So to validate the truth rule, we've got to first prove that there's a non-deceiving God. The validation of the truth rule rests upon there being a non-deceiving God. Well, there being a non-deceiving God rests upon these other premises, because Descartes gives arguments for there being a non-deceiving God. And those arguments are going to rest upon the premises of those arguments, premises such as the causal principle of ideas. Or you can think of the argument that God's not a deceiver. Descartes says one of the key premises of that argument, deception is a defect, is an imperfection. That would be, so you could list that under causal principle of ideas, right? That claim could be part of the etc. there. So our argument for a non-deceiving God rests upon certain premises. Okay, fine. Well, why do you think those premises are true, Descartes? Where do those premises come from? And Descartes got an answer for that. He's very clear. These premises, such as the causal principle of ideas, or this claim that deception is a defect, he says they're known by the natural light. That's where I got them from. I just kind of, think this way. I consulted the natural light. Yeah. And the natural light, if you recall, is just another phrase that Descartes uses for vivid and clear perception. And so what he's saying here is that I know the causal principle of ideas is true. Why? Well, because I vividly and clearly perceived it. That's why I think it's true. I know that deception is a defect because I vividly and clearly perceive that deception is a defect. Well, what that indicates is that Descartes is assuming that whatever is known by vivid and clear perception or the natural light is true. But that's the truth rule. The truth rule states whatever I vividly and clearly perceive is true. In making use of the causal principle of ideas, just to pick one example, Descartes is assuming the truth rule. He's assuming that whatever he vividly and clearly perceives is true. That's why he uses the causal principle of ideas. I vividly and clearly perceive it, and so he uses it in his argument. Well, Descartes then assuming the truth rule is true in his argument for the truth of the truth rule, right? The causal principle of ideas has an arrow going from it to the truth rule because the causal principle of ideas, his use of it, rests upon the truth rule being true. If it's not true, Descartes can't help himself to the causal principle of ideas. He can only help himself to the causal principle of ideas if the truth rule is true, if whatever is known by the natural light is in fact true. Another way to think about this part of the circle. What if there's a deceiving God? Right? That was the reason we had for doubting the truth rule. That whatever we vividly and clearly perceive is true, right? Well, that seems to apply equally to the causal principle of ideas. Fine, you vividly and clearly perceive it, but you can't just help yourself to that yet, that you vividly and clearly perceive it. That's the whole thing that you're trying to establish is legitimate. That's what the project of validating the truth rule is supposed to do. It's supposed to show that vivid and clear perception is a legitimate way of acquiring knowledge. You're assuming it already is a legitimate way of acquiring knowledge, Descartes, by making use of the causal principle of ideas. In other words, Descartes commits the fallacy of begging the question. He assumes the truth of the truth rule in his argument for the truth of the truth rule. He assumes that what he's trying to prove is true already. You can't argue that way. That's a bad way of arguing. It's arguing in a circle. Yeah? Arguing in a circle, begging the question, those are the same thing. Those are different ways of talking about the same fallacy. That's the Cartesian circle. Right. And so people want, and so as you can kind of see, this applies to the project more generally. It really kind of attaches to the third meditation, but it's a problem with the very kind of basic strategy that Descartes employs. It's a problem with the project of the meditations. And if you think this problem is serious, and if you think, which a number of people have, and that it kind of sinks Descartes' project, well, where would that leave Descartes? This kind of leaves untouched the cogito, so you could give that to him, but that's all he would have. And so Descartes would, in a sense, still be kind of trapped in his mind. He would have never shown that there's a non-deceiving God. He would have never shown that the truth rule is legitimate. He would have never shown that he can trust his vivid and clear perceptions. He would have shown that he exists. He would have shown that he can think. Maybe he can be certain that it appears to him that there's a computer in front of him right now and things like that. But is there an external world? Who knows? Does God exist? Who knows? All of this other stuff he would have to be skeptical about, right? And so if this Cartesian circle is a legitimate problem for Descartes, Descartes would not have shown very much at all. Descartes would never have, if this really sinks the project, what that means is that Descartes fails in his attempt to refound human knowledge. All right, now I'm going to kind of zoom out, and this will be a kind of, I don't know, it's not about the sixth meditation in particular, but it's about Descartes in general. We're going to try to situate Descartes as a philosopher in terms of the categories that we've been looking at this semester of the kind of sub-kinds of philosophy that there are. So we've talked about metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics as kind of comprising philosophy. Those are the three main subdisciplines. And we've looked at Plato and Aristotle, and now we have Descartes. So let's throw Plato up there. So very quick recap of Plato. We did this when we looked at Aristotle, but Plato had certain things to say about metaphysics. He talked about the theory of forms in the Republic, the divided line, the image of the sun, the image of the cave. All this had this theory of the forms baked into it. Forms are the essences of things. They're in a separate realm. Our minds can access them. And what it is to know a thing is to know the form of the thing, right? And so the theory of forms is also an epistemological theory. Part of this theory of the forms is all this stuff about participation. The things in this world that we encounter, sensible things, are they participate in forms. And so your hand participates in the form of hand, and that's what makes it a hand. Yeah, all that was part of Plato's metaphysical views. He also kind of gestured towards this stuff about body and soul. He actually kind of looks a bit like a Cartesian dualist. He seemed to suggest that there were these two different things. There was the body and there was the soul on the one hand, and there are certain things he suggested that seemed to make it look like the soul, that's really what you are. And so Plato seemed to be a bit of a Cartesian dualist himself. With regard to epistemology, the main thing that we got was from the Republic concerning the divided line and the image of the cave. The divided line talked about different kinds of knowledge that we might have, different kinds of mental states that we might be in, different kinds of cognitive grasps that you might have. And at the very end of the divided line, if you recall, was what he called understanding. That's when you grasp a form, right? Forms are the objects of knowledge. Understanding is the mental state you're in there. And what becomes very clear from the image of the cave in particular is that that's what you want. You want truth. Truth is of the highest value, and it's the mark of an educated person. And if you recall from the Gorgias, an educated person is a happy person. It's a person who's living a good life. It's the mark of an educated person, Plato indicates in the Republic, to have your soul turn toward the truth, to take truth as the highest value. Yeah, that's kind of as far as it goes with epistemology. And so everything he says about epistemology is really highly bound up with ethics and metaphysics. Metaphysics we've kind of talked about. Let's go forward to ethics now, right? Start with that second point. The philosophic life is the best life. Well, yeah, that's all this stuff about having your soul turn toward the truth. In the Gorgias, we also get all this stuff about how a good life is a virtuous one. So you want to, and you get this analogy with the crafts and so on, right? Okay, so virtue, that kind of stuff comes up. Aristotle, we get a more extended account of how sensible things and forms are related. Hylomorphism. He's got a different notion of form, but the hylomorphism is supposed to be a theory of sensible things in the world and how they're constituted, their ontological structure. Aristotle also delves into the philosophy of mind, talking about how the soul is a kind of form and how it's hooked up to bodies. And there are different kinds of souls, and they're hooked up to bodies in different kinds of ways, right? Look at the Dynamo. These are metaphysical theories. Aristotle's thoughts about God, the unmoved mover, God as pure form or pure actuality, those, and he gives an argument for the existence of God. Those are also all metaphysical theories, part of Aristotle's metaphysical outlook. When it comes to epistemology, in certain ways, everything he says about epistemology, at least that we looked at, is kind of parasitic, like it was the case in Plato, is parasitic upon either his metaphysics or his ethics. So we get this stuff about the four causes, but the way he understands the four causes, they are intimately bound up with his hylomorphism. Three of those four causes, formal, efficient, and final, when it comes to natural organisms, are going to coincide to a very great extent according to Aristotle, right? And so the four causes is closely related to his hylomorphism. And why do I call that an epistemological theory? Well, it's an account. Aristotle presents it, the four causes, as an account of the best explanation of a thing. If you want to understand or explain a thing, you have to cite its four causes. And so as far as that goes, in terms of it's talking about the best explanation or how we best understand a thing, it's going to be an epistemological theory. It's a theory that relates to our knowledge. Like with Plato, Aristotle also has all this stuff about the philosophic life, which leads into ethics. Right. So he doesn't quite put it this way, but he would also say that truth or knowledge is of the highest value, and it's what we really ought to aim at and pursue in our lives. And for Aristotle, the way he addresses this, so moving now into the ethics column, the contemplative life is the best life. And he argues for this in book 10. Okay, fine, good. Also with regard to ethics, and this is related to his account of the contemplative life and why it's the best life, but you have his notion of happiness. That's really what we focused on from the ethics. So happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. It's acting virtuously, right? Aristotle spends a lot of time talking about that, and that bleeds over into his epistemological theories. Okay, so that's by way of review. What we find a lot of similarities between Plato and Aristotle. We've talked about it already. We've talked about some of the differences. One thing that I want to stress now, a kind of similarity that's already been contained in what I've been saying, neither of them are primarily epistemologists. They delve into epistemological questions and issues because those questions or issues are related to something else, right? They're related to various ethical ideas that they have. They talk about truth and knowledge because they have a particular vision of what a good, happy life is. It's a life that involves those kinds of things. They talk about truth and knowledge because that's what God is interested in, right? This is particularly the case with Aristotle. Truth and knowledge is of the highest value. This is not quite how Aristotle puts it, but truth and knowledge are of the highest value because that's the life that God lives. It's a life like that. And we as human beings can kind of imitate that in certain ways. Okay. Things are different when we get to Descartes. So when it comes to metaphysics, what we've seen from Descartes is he puts forward a kind of substance dualism. That's a metaphysical theory. That's a theory in the philosophy of mind. He also argues that God exists. That's a metaphysical thesis. That's a thesis about what there is in the world. But when it comes to epistemology, things get very, very different, right? So as far as substance dualism goes, yeah, I don't know, maybe Plato is a substance dualist, Cartesian dualist. Aristotle even says things that kind of hint in that direction, right? He says the mind is separable. He says the mind doesn't have a bodily organ. That looks like substance dualism. And Aristotle argues God exists, and Descartes does too. They give very different arguments. But they both think God exists, and Plato, for as far as we can tell, seems to think God exists too. In fact, in a different dialogue called The Laws, he argues that God exists. Okay, fine, they all think God exists. They all have some sort of dualistic, maybe, Aristotle's a little controversial, but some sort of dualistic view of the human person, of the philosophy of mind. Epistemology, things get very, very different. Descartes' primary occupation is with epistemology. That's his starting, that's where he starts from. So what I have up here is methodological skepticism. What does that mean? That refers to Descartes' initial starting orientation. Descartes starts his project by calling everything into doubt. His immediate kind of question is, how can we know anything? Can we know anything? Well, how could we ever be sure that we know anything? How could we be certain that we know anything? We need to have certain foundations for knowledge. We need to have foundations for knowledge which couldn't possibly be false. How could we ever be sure that we had foundations like that? Descartes introduces these skeptical hypotheses to help find these foundations. Right? So he introduces skepticism, not because he thinks it's true. He doesn't think that we don't actually know anything. He thinks we know all kinds of things. He introduces it because it offers him a way to proceed, a way to find the strongest foundations. It's methodological. It's a way of proceeding. right? Skepticism is a way of proceeding. That's all I mean by methodological skepticism. And I didn't make that phrase up. That's how people describe Descartes' skepticism, right? But that's an epistemological view, that that's the best way to proceed, the best way to find knowledge, the best way to find the foundations of knowledge at the very least. That's an epistemological view. Also, his idea that what we want is certainty. We need to find foundations for human knowledge that are certain, right? That's also a kind of epistemological view, an epistemological question or issue. Now, ethics. What does Descartes have to say about ethics? He didn't really write about it. There are some letters that he wrote to, I can't remember, he corresponded with a bunch of people. I think it was a princess. Can't remember exactly. Might have been a queen, I don't know. But there are some letters he wrote in which he kind of starts talking a little bit about ethics, but he never really wrote about ethics. That just wasn't an occupation of his. That's not what he was concerned with. If anything, it seems like Plato and Aristotle were primarily interested in ethics. Descartes, not concerned. Moreover, what we find with Descartes' epistemology and metaphysics, a lot of the metaphysics, at least all this stuff about God, comes in merely for these epistemological ends. Descartes proves the existence of God, not because that in its own right would be an important thing to do, although maybe he thinks that, but he does it for a very particular purpose. He proves God's existence in order to give us this divine guarantee, in order to establish the truth rule, in order to keep building up this edifice of knowledge. God is like a key brick in that structure. Yeah. That's why he proves God's existence. He proves God's existence because he's ultimately trying to establish these foundations for all of human knowledge. And what Descartes pretty clearly thinks is that you're not going to be able to do that unless you have this divine guarantee for, in particular, sense perception. That's what we've looked at, right? The only reason you can actually believe and trust that there is a hand there is because there's this kind of divine guarantee, and God's not a deceiver. Right? God put that propensity in me, and so yeah, I think that. And so Descartes is primarily an epistemologist. That's first and foremost what he is. Those are the central questions he's interested in. Questions about knowledge, about what it consists in, how we get it, what the best foundations for it are, and how we get those foundations, right? Descartes is primarily concerned with knowledge. And the reason I would give you for why he's primarily concerned with epistemological questions is because of the particular context in which he's writing. The scientific revolution. The scientific revolution had shattered the old Aristotelian paradigm. It had kind of been crumbling in various ways. People had been attacking it. But the scientific revolution really kind of shattered that intellectual paradigm, right? And when an intellectual paradigm shatters like that, it introduces or makes very pressing these epistemological questions. How do we know anything? We thought we knew all this stuff for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then boom, wrong. We're totally wrong. We Aristotelians, we thought we were doing all this work. We thought we were inquiring into how nature works, and we thought it was going fine, but it turned out we were just wrong. We had certain foundational assumptions about teleology, for example, wrong. That intellectual paradigm has kind of been shattered by the scientific revolution. That makes epistemological questions particularly pressing. And Descartes felt those questions. And what he is trying to do is come up with a new intellectual paradigm, right? A new alternative to this old Aristotelian paradigm. And one of the things that we've seen is that it's not clear that he was actually able to do that. It's not clear that the intellectual paradigm that he came up with was stable and likely to last, to use some of his own words that he uses in the first meditation. It's not clear that it was coherent, that it really hangs together. So you can see Descartes as someone who kind of is writing in the aftermath of this kind of destruction of the Aristotelian intellectual paradigm, who's trying to come up with something new, but can't quite make it all hang together, right? He's trying to put things back in order, but the pieces don't quite fit, and he can't quite get it all to work, right? And I think that's a fair enough assessment of Descartes, because it's not as though everyone became Cartesians after this. In some sense, everyone did become an Aristotelian after Aristotle, in some very broad, general sense. As we had discussed earlier, Aristotle sets the intellectual paradigm going forward. Descartes doesn't do that. And so we're still, Descartes trying to establish a new intellectual paradigm, but is arguably unsuccessful. Well, where do we go from here? Well, other modern philosophers try to do the same thing. But maybe it works out. We're not going to look at these other philosophers. Maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't. We're going to now fast forward to Nietzsche, who is going to take something like this view of Descartes and Aristotle and so on. Aristotle, there was this intellectual paradigm, somewhat well-formed, consistent, but it ultimately crumbles apart. Aristotle, right? This Aristotelian paradigm. And then these modern philosophers, such as Descartes, try to deal with the wreckage of this paradigm, try to put things back together in some sort of way, some sort of new way, right? But it doesn't work. Well, where does that leave us? That's where Nietzsche picks things up. And so we'll start turning to that next week.